Welcome to Global Shift, where we track the global transition away from the neoliberal world disorder towards a new emerging planetary order and help to unpack and make sense of the latest news and geopolitical events. The many updates that I was making to the last post on the situation in the Middle East finally boiled over into an article which I posted on the website last night. I've put a link in the video description box below. Now, there's a lot of things going on in Europe and in Ukraine and between the Trump administration and the EU at the moment. But if in this video I'm going to return to summarize developments in the Middle East, I would like quickly to advertise the fact that these other subjects will be covered in the next video/article. Let's go over some of that very quickly. As I've said before, there hasn't been much, for me at least, to say about Russia's war against NATO in Ukraine since the battle for Bakhmut, except that there has been an inexorable advance by Russian forces. This has been covered on a daily basis by many excellent commentators who have given blow-by-blow accounts of developments on the battlefield, and this has served marvellously as an antidote to the rubbish news peddled by British, American and German media. However, I did feel it was appropriate back in July 2023 to say that NATO had been defeated. And this is because I took the long-term perspective that where Russia had collapsed, along with the Soviet Union back in the 1990s when Mikhail Gorbachev gave Ronald Reagan the keys to the Soviet state, the country has now emerged like a phoenix from the ashes to become a great power again. So I judged back in July 2023, when it had secured its access to the Mediterranean through Crimea and by capturing Turkey, a NATO member, note, by boxing it in Syria, that it had returned to the status of the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. It also had the weapons to maintain that position. So, in my opinion, it had won against the inexorable advance of NATO that had begun under Bill Clinton. It is interesting to note that the Trump administration's approach to Ukraine is driven entirely by cultural and emotional factors that are embedded in the right-wing MAGA movement, that is the successor of the Tea Party movement. This movement, the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, seeks peace with Russia because its adherents view Russians as a white race and Putin as somebody who has brought back Christianity to Russia by re-establishing the Orthodox Church and countering the woke narrative of modern liberalism. And this is in spite of the fact that Putin actually presides over the most multi-ethnic, multi-religious country in the world, and that most white Russians actually don't seem to go much to church. At least not as much as Tatars, Chechens, Dagestanis, immigrant Tajiks, Turkmens, Kazakhs and the like go to pray at the mosque. Furthermore, the Russian state is a rational state in the Westphalian sense, typical of the kind of 18th and 19th century state that existed in Central and Eastern Europe. In fact, it isn't much at all like the Tsarist Russian state of tradition. By comparison, the United States is not a rational state. It is currently driven entirely by the emotions behind the culture wars which are encouraged by the corporations which own and run America in order to keep a lid on democracy and accountability. Questions of social justice are usefully drowned in the cacophony of the culture wars. But in this context, we have to note that the MAGA movement and the religious right may love Putin's Russia, but they hate Palestinians. Billionaire televangelists like John Hagee preach that salvation will only come to the dispossessed and marginalized of America if Palestinians burn in hell. So if the videos and articles on this site keep going back to the Middle East, this is because, in the light of all of this, the status of the Palestinians is a compelling matter for the free peoples of this world who are concerned with justice. And there is the very important fact that if a country like Saudi Arabia, which I am following closely, has decoupled from the American empire because of its relations with China, there is also the unspoken truth, which, as I say, I will talk about in my next video / article, the unspoken truth that the American empire has effectively also decoupled from Saudi Arabia and Arabian oil. American trade deficits are no longer funded by Arabian oil, or only very little. They are now funded almost entirely by the vast recycled profits of Google, Apple, Facebook, Oracle, Nvidia, Amazon and the like. The dollar is no longer a petrodollar. That is a myth. For want of a better word, I suppose we could call it a digital dollar, although we'd have to find something a bit better, I think. Now, this is exactly the reason why Trump is threatening Britain and European countries with tariffs unless they lift the digital taxes that they impose on those monopoly capitalist organizations which fund America, and fund them, by the way, anonymously through all the world's tax havens. This is why Trump tells us today that the EU was formed to screw the US. Europe is failing because it didn't create its own tech giants. China is hated because it did. So when we support Palestine and America's support and confront America's support for Israel, we are combating a purely racist phenomenon. Israel is no longer needed to protect the oil, and it costs the US huge amounts of money. But all the wise guys who make up the Trump administration are emotionally Zionists. There's no rational basis for their foreign policy. This is why everything comes down ultimately to physical conflict. Even if they look at cutting expenditure on forever wars around the world, they keep spending on Israel, although the United States as a state gains nothing. The billionaire class, especially the Jewish billionaire class, completely against the beliefs of the average Jewish person in America, greenmail American universities in order to ban pro-Palestine protests and muzzle free speech, because it is an emotional requirement of theirs. The need to feel superior, the need to feel powerful. They can do this. This is what their money is for. They also fight against Black Lives Matter, but the attraction for them of funding the murder of Palestinians is that it takes place abroad. Despite their control of the American system, genocide would be difficult to carry out on the streets of, say, Philadelphia today. I use the example of Philadelphia because the name was given to the city by the Quakers, and it means love your brother. The Quakers, if you remember, are the primary movers of slavery abolition. Anyway, but now back to the current subject of the article I've posted. There seems to be strange quiet in Gaza, relatively speaking, of course. By Israel's brutal and malicious standards, its current infringements and killings are running at sort of normal peacetime levels. Apart from the killing and maiming, which has taken the total dead and injured to above 160,000, children are actually currently dying of the cold because Israel won't allow the tents in through the Rafah crossing, where they're all lined up on huge trucks. Anyway, but if this is the quiet before the storm, it doesn't yet look as if the storm will be in Gaza. We are actually left with the apparently clear message from Steve Witkoff, Trump's unofficial envoy for West Asia, now famous for bulldozing through the first stage of the ceasefire, that there will absolutely be a second stage, in his words, to the ceasefire agreement. So what happened to Trump's threatened beachfront real estate development? According to Witkoff, this decidedly odd announcement, which was made on the 4th of February, was just a manifestation of the method Trump regularly uses to shake up everybody's thinking. A post on this website suggested at the time that it was a way for Trump to keep the peace in Gaza and to dodge Netanyahu. After all, his envoy Witkoff had negotiated the ceasefire. But Netanyahu wasn't going to be put down this way. And just 2 days later, still in Washington, he took matters into his own hands and suggested that if Trump's beachfront plan for Gaza was going to work and the enclave had to be emptied, perhaps it was time for Saudi Arabia to set up a Palestinian state on its own territory, because they have a lot of land there, in his words. If there has been a single remark that can possibly be said to have tipped the scales of history, this was it. Tracking the shift in Saudi Arabia's official foreign policy over the past 3 years, it is clear that there have been 3 stages in the development. The first was the 23rd of March 2023 peace agreement with Iran, which was set up in line with the needs of the China-backed Vision 2030 development plan for Saudi Arabia. This brought about what I have called throughout the new diplomacy between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The second stage was the announcement on the 10th of November 2024 of a new strategic partnership with Iran, which included military cooperation, especially on missiles. This followed the announcement of the Netanyahu cabinet of the plan for a greater Israel, which would cover most of the Middle East. The third stage came on the 11th of February, when there was a cabinet meeting led by King Salman in Riyadh, which repudiated Trump's Gaza plan and made the agreement on a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem an ineradicable part of any future negotiations on relations with the United States. This followed the meeting in which Trump reiterated his Gaza plan to a shocked and speechless King Abdullah of Jordan in the Oval Office. In order to avoid another ambush of the same kind, the Saudis advised Egypt's President Sisi to cancel his own trip to visit Trump, and he did just that. Now, this was a considerable hardening of Saudi Arabia's position on Palestine. The country's leadership had previously been prepared to consider a formal roadmap towards a Palestinian state, rather than a full and immediate recognition. Now, this sets up an inevitable confrontation with Israel's current extreme right-wing government and its visions for the future. Since then, since the 11th of February, it is important to note Trump has been quiet on Gaza. When Hamas delayed releasing some hostages because Israel was not keeping to its side of the ceasefire bargain, this was met with an apparently furious Trump on the 10th of February, who promised that all hell will break loose in Gaza if all the hostages weren't released by the following Saturday. They weren't. Hamas just stuck to its side of the bargain without flinching. Trump said nothing and has done nothing since the official Saudi statement on Palestine was released on the 11th of February. Actually, all we've had since then was Witkoff's 17th of February, where he said there will absolutely be a second stage to the ceasefire agreement. Clearly, Trump's dream of gaining $1 trillion Saudi dollars risked evaporating if there were to be a rupture with Riyadh. He had made this particular demand publicly over his podium at the World Economic Forum in Davos in response to Saudi Arabia's generous plan to invest $600 billion in the United States over a 10-year period. Clearly, that offer was the plan of a decoupling, rational Saudi state, thinking it was wise to keep up friendly relations with the Americans and to try to give the United States a stake in its future. At Davos, Trump just translated this into the language of a hold-up in the Wild West. The potential for a rupture was now very real. Much as the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been known in discussions with American and Israeli politicians to make light of the Palestinian question, this tactical behavior, intended presumably to keep negotiators on side by gaining their sympathy, has been misunderstood. Achieving a Palestinian state is vital for the peace necessary to Saudi Arabia's strategy for survival, the Vision 2030 development plan. The very essence of this plan is predicated on engagement of the world's Muslim community in the global south, with religious tourism counting for far greater projected revenues in the future than any leisure tourism from Western countries could, or indeed all revenues. Note here that Saudi Arabia is trying, under Vision 2030, to become a leader also in the production of green hydrogen, and is entering the field of nuclear energy. There is a very real sense in which Saudi Arabia finds itself in a difficult situation. This it will only be able to resolve through the adoption of the one tactic which, in the past, for largely cultural reasons, it has avoided, and that is the use of confrontation. An informal mini-summit of Arab nations in Saudi Arabia took place at an undisclosed location between the 20th and 22nd February. It ended without a joint statement, other than to agree a formal Arab League summit in Cairo set for March the 4th. Gaza is definitely on the agenda for that meeting. Most significantly, however, a special invitation was extended to the current head of the Syrian government, the ex-leader of Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, Ahmed al-Shara, to the Arab League summit in Cairo. This suggests that discussion at the mini-summit of regional policy went far beyond the issue of Palestine, recognizing the urgent need to embed that particular issue in a united overall regional policy agreed by all the meeting's participants, and these were Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt and Jordan. The invitation extended to al-Shara tells us in no uncertain terms that the fate of Syria is integral to this regional plan. It is only too clear that Syria will be increasingly contested. Israel has recently demanded the full demilitarization of southern Syria. The new Syrian regime is not allowed to put any armed personnel, not even police, in that area. The area we're talking about is the land between Israel's occupying positions in the buffer zone that they have created along the Golan Heights and Damascus. In the article that I've posted, I provide a map of what's happening there. Following that announcement, there was an intense aerial bombardment yesterday that went deep into the countryside surrounding the south of Damascus. These demands for demilitarization accompanied an Israeli decision to divide up Syria into cantons, not just dividing it, but also reshaping the area's demography along sectarian lines. This policy is looking in particular to create a Druze state in Syria, a Druze state which Druze leaders in Syria themselves don't want. The irony is that the Druze in general have no political mission to form a state, and whether they live in Israel, Lebanon or Syria, they tend to identify with the state that they live in, unless they have a specific reason to disagree with the ruling regime. For instance, the leader of the Lebanese Druze, Walid Jumblat, backed Hezbollah in their war of support for Gaza, even as Israeli Druze fought in the ranks of the Israeli army. So Israel's demographic management of southern Syria bears thinking about, and I believe it is part of a policy of explicitly dividing Syria into cantons for ulterior motives. It bears all the signs of the ground being prepared for the expulsion to this area of Palestinians from the West Bank. 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced from refugee camps primarily in Jenin and Tulkarm. They are crowding towards the northern border of the West Bank with Israel. Israeli tanks have been deployed to the West Bank in a highly unusual move, and presumably as a signal of a potential massive escalation of atrocities. With the control that the Israeli army seemed to be able to achieve in southern Syria, there would appear to be the intention to use this opportunity to execute mass expulsions in a way that would obviate a direct confrontation with Jordan. Like Egypt, Jordan has been successful in resisting any attempts to push Palestinians onto its territory, going so far as threatening Israel with war. Both the Jordanian and Egyptian armies are organized armies that Israel will have to respect. This is especially the case in the light of the devastation that its own army has suffered in the 15-month war in Gaza and the 66-day war of assault on Lebanon, which followed the war of support for Gaza that Hezbollah conducted, in which Israeli forces failed and were repelled. Following on the criticisms of many informed observers and ex-generals of the Israeli forces, Israeli military historian Uri Bar Joseph recently called the Israeli army a 1 trillion shekel operation that is a bad and hysterical army which has lost all its self-confidence. So in that context, Egypt's and Jordan's threats must be taken seriously. But those threats are all the more serious because were confrontations to unfold, the Egyptian army would have the support of Hamas, both inside and outside the Gaza Strip, and Jordan could count on the support of the Lebanese resistance. Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qasim, in his last but one speech, said that he would help. But there are many conflicting interests in Syria, representing different regional powers. What is plain to see on the Syrian scene is increasing Turkish anger, for instance, over Israel's advances in Syria, and the fact that the southern Damascus countryside appears increasingly to be turning into a border between Israeli and Turkish zones of influence. But if the Arab nations gathering in Cairo on the 4th of March now are angry at Israel, they also find Turkish influence over Damascus and the potential coming division of Syria unacceptable. Be assured that plans are afoot to change all of that. The Umayyad Mosque and Masjid al-Umawi in Damascus is as much a symbol of Arab history as the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem is of Islamic history. What the mini-summit of the 20th to 22nd February will most certainly have done for Saudi Arabia is to bring the UAE in from the cold on the question of Israel and to pull Qatar away from its relations it has built up with Turkey during the time of the blockade of Qatar between 2017 and 2021. A blockade which, by the way, was encouraged by the first Trump administration. And I've put an interesting link in the article on the Trump family involvement in the blockade of Qatar. So how things are changing now. Qatar, for instance, is already playing a supportive role in Lebanon, supportive of Saudi Arabia, that is. Furthermore, there's an interesting point. There is evidence to show that the marginalizing of ex-PM Prime Minister Naguib Mikati in the recent new elections, which turned out in favor of the ex-International Court of Justice chief, Nawaf Salam, that this was done at the behest of Saudi Arabia. Mikati's early unscripted visit to Damascus to visit ex-HTS leader, now Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara, who was clearly installed there by the Turks, caused intense Saudi anger. Al-Shara's invitation to Cairo was seen tested for the extent of his Turkish allegiance. However, this is unlikely to be a satisfying encounter for gathered Arab leaders, given that it has become patently clear that Al-Shara is all things to all men. So watch this space for trouble to come. Meanwhile, the United States continues to pursue what can only be called bomb diplomacy. It has supplied Israel with the 30,000-pound GBU-43 massive ordnance air blast bomb, also called the mother of all bombs, which can only be dropped from the back of a C-130 transport aircraft. As the name indicates, however, it is an air blast bomb which is useless against Palestinian and Lebanese tunnels and pretty useless not only against Iranian underground facilities but also against Iranian missile defense systems, given that the C-130 travels only at the speed of a fast car. The fact that the supply of the bomb was announced by Steve Witkoff in Germany to the pro-Israeli Bild tabloid, however, does seem to indicate that the United States is just seeking here to counter the Russian propaganda over its new Oreshnik missile, a missile which has massive destructive power but avoids the radioactive fallout of a nuclear weapon. The Oreshnik obviously is frightening the Germans. Nevertheless, incoming Zionist Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, made a show of releasing a batch of 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs to Israel recently as a mark of friendship and racist commitment. Perhaps this is a sign of a reboot of the Gaza war. The problem with that scenario, is being hotly debated in Washington right now, because if the Arab nations meeting on March the 4th are, for the first time since 1967, deadly serious about what they want, and there is every reason to think that they are, Israel restarting the war will be extremely expensive for the Trump administration. It has to be remembered that the security establishments across the Arab world have watched intently as the Israeli army has been defeated on the battlefield by what are indigenous insurgent groups, despite absolutely historic levels of bombardment. As the Israeli military historian Uri Bar Joseph said on the trillion-shekel army, it has been shown to be an empty shell, although it is currently on a dangerous course, overreaching as it is in Syria, only because there is yet no one there organized enough to confront it. Thank you for listening, and look out for my next video/article about the situation in Europe and Ukraine. Thank you.